think about 40-ish minutes. And we'll start with Léon and Sheila today. I will introduce them shortly. I just want to let you all know that there is a Q&A function. So if you have questions, you can type them into there and someone will monitor it, and we will have a separate Q&A session afterwards. So we'll have the talk first and then a 5-minute break, and then we will resume with a Q&A. So you can type your questions into that. There's also a separate chat function, and you can just type, comments that you have that. If for some reason you can't use a Q&A function, the chat one should be fine, and we will look at that as well. Right. Okay, so let me introduce our speakers for today. The talk is Autism in Black Majority Churches in the United Kingdom. We have got Dr. Léon van Ommen. He is a senior lecturer here at the University of Aberdeen, and his research explores the intersection of autism, sensory experience, liturgy, and spirituality. He's currently focused on this research on Black and marginalised communities and how they experience worship and religious belonging. And we've got Dr. Sheila Akomiah, who is Research Fellow, working with Léon on this project, Access Denied, Spirituality at the Intersections of Autism, Ethnic Minority and Non-Speaking Autism. Sheila also lectures in African theology at the Church Mission Society in Oxford, and she's a presbyter in an African Pentecostal church in Glasgow. Amazing. So I think Sheila will start us off today. Whenever you're ready, Sheila.
Thank you very much, Audrey. Thank you for the introduction. And once again, welcome everyone to the third and final day of this conference. And if today is the first time you're joining, you're certainly welcome. If you've been on from Wednesday, then thank you for your perseverance. But I hope that you have had a good, not just a good time, but a knowledgeable time as we have shared ideas together and had these discussions over these past days. So today we are going to be looking at Black autistic adults and their faith lives, Black autistic adults in the UK and their faith lives. And I'm going to just begin by doing a brief overview of the presentation. And then after that, I'll hand over to Léon and I'll take over again. So I'm going to start the presentation or the talk by just speaking through some of the rationales behind the research. I'm going to go on to talk you through the research process, so some of the things we did to arrive where we arrived. And then I'm going to focus on the findings from our research with Black autistic adults. After that, Léon is going to come in and talk about our findings from our research with Black church leaders, Black or African church leaders in the UK. Then afterwards, we'll draw some conclusions and close with a Q&A later on. So I'm going to hand over to Léon to start us off by telling us, he's a visionary of the project. So we're telling us how he came up with the vision for this project, which is generally called the Access Denied project. And then I'll take over. Léon?
Thanks, Sheila. Yes, and also from me, a very warm welcome to this third day of the conference. As I said yesterday, and at the opening of the conference on Wednesday, there were a couple of reasons for doing this project. And one of the reasons was that I discovered that certain groups of people are massively overlooked in the research. And one of those groups are actually people from ethnically minoritized or racially minoritized communities. Much of the autism research, just in general, I'm not speaking about autism theology necessarily, just autism studies in general, is quite dominated by Western or global North perspectives, by white perspectives. And we see that there is a lot of misunderstanding about autism in ethnically minoritized communities. And so I was keen just to know more. And so we try to find out what is the experience of spirituality and religion for Black autistic people in the UK. Also because we thought that probably religion is going to come up as an important factor, more so than in the dominant autism discourse, because almost all ethnically minoritized groups in the UK, at least, will also be quite religious, more so than the dominantly white population in the UK. So there was I thought there's every reason to look into that. And then we also wanted to find out how their faith communities view autism, theologically or otherwise, to discover what theological views enable or stand in the way of autistic people's spiritual and religious flourishing. And so, yeah, we were just keen to find that out. And that's the background of this project. And then I was very happy to be able to work with Sheila, who worked as a postdoctoral researcher on this project, and her inside knowledge of some of the communities that we worked with was just incredibly helpful. Having said that, we also realized very well that even when you say about, say, Black ethnic minorities in the UK, we are speaking about many, many different communities. We are speaking about many different churches and denominations. We know that fully well, and we will also, when it comes to the data collection that we will present today, we will also indicate where our participants were coming from. So yeah, that's the background, and I'm going to hand over to Sheila again.
Thank you very much, Léon. And to add my voice to what Léon has already started, why did this research matter? He's made the first point already, the fact that Black autistic adults and faith life, those four actually intersections, is a very complex intersection, and one that is very, very much under-researched. And if I'm not mistaken, at least in our context in the UK, what we have started to do, it looks like pioneering research. So this is a conversation that we have started to broach and kind of open the door for more to be done. So a very under-researched area in not just autism studies, but even social studies as well. The second point is that, and this came out from my own personal experience and from one of the comments we received from one of the church leaders we engaged with, who said, I've noticed a handful of autistic children in our congregation, but I have yet to meet any autistic adults. Now, for a while, I found that comment a bit troubling. However, later on, after reflecting on it and even comparing my own experience side by side with it, I found out it was a very fair observation, because in my own experience, looking at my current church context, I didn't know any Black autistic adults in my church. So there's a visible absence of Black autistic adults, Christians, in Christian faith spaces in the UK. And this is well, an issue that needs much more probing. So we see that the voices of Black autistic Christian adults are silent in research, and they are also silent in faith spaces. And for me, this is even more than a social justice issue. So making their voices heard, bringing their voices and their views, and just bringing them to the table is a social justice issue. And this was even highlighted when I started interviewing and interacting with some Black autistic adults in research. When one said, I'm happy you're doing this, and for 100%, I can say confidently, of the people I engage with, they all told me that they hadn't had this opportunity, any opportunity in the past, to speak about their faith and their autistic situation in the ways that we have started to have this conversation. So making the voices of this group of people heard in faith life, in church, and just in society in general, it's a very important issue to look at. The other point, and I am going to make this quote by John Mbiti, who is a famous African theologian, And he made this very famous statement talking about the spirituality of Black Africans, that the African is notoriously religious. And this just goes to the fact that spirituality and religion is central to Black and African communal lives. But as we have seen from our research and the glaring absence of Black autistic adults in faith spaces, we can see that these spaces seem inaccessible to them. So why is this happening? Why is this the situation when faith and spirituality it's very important to Black and African communal lives? And how can we change this? So asking the question of why and trying to find a solution to changing the situation, I believe it's also a very important feat to attempt. So in this research, with what we did, our main aim was to try and listen deeply to Black autistic voices, but not just Black autistic voices, but also the voices of Black church leaders. And our aim was to try and gain some knowledge, share this knowledge, and produce resources that will be helpful for Black autistic Christians and for Black churches in their faith and communal lives. So these are kind of some of the pointers or the things that inspired and spurred on our research and study. So then what did we do? How did we go about trying to attempt this big feat? So our aim initially was to conduct in-depth interviews with 20 Black autistic adults. However, as we started our recruitment process, we came across several challenges in achieving this goal. And we ended up being able to interact with or recruit 10 Black autistic adults with which we conducted in-depth interviews. All of these people, like the focus of this research was also on adults for a reason, because there is some research, maybe not related to spirituality, but a lot of the time there is some existing research about the lives of autistic children, or maybe even Black autistic children, but the voices of Black autistic adults is what we meant or aimed to highlight. So our participants were all adults aged 18 plus, and in the next few slides, I'll give you an idea of the age range for the 10 people we were able to engage with. We recruited participants. We started with social media, and we experienced several challenges we hadn't envisaged in that area. One of them being bogus participants, so people who didn't meet the criteria. A lot of people actually who didn't meet the criteria, but still, trying to get into the research. So we had to sit back and regroup and try and see how to not scan but review participants properly to ensure that those we were speaking with actually met the requirements of our research. We also advertised for participants through the Center for Autism and Theology's networks. We used other networks available to us, like church and community networks. And we also did some snowballing. So where we had engaged with people, we asked them to recommend other people who might qualify for participation. And through this process, we were able to engage in depth with 10 Black autistic Christian adults. And the resulting thematic analysis are the findings that we're going to be sharing with you today. So apart from the Black autistic adults, we also, as I mentioned earlier, wanted to explore the theological views of Black church leaders, Black or African church leaders in the UK. And for this, we opted to go for a qualitative survey instead of an interview, because after discussion and through other examples of research, we found that, first of all, we'll be able to reach more church leaders this way. So we'll get quantity more through this area, this approach. And also, the fact that because this was a very sensitive issue and one that many church leaders may never have explored or discussed before, a face-to-face interview may maybe have affected how comfortable or how freely some church leaders would be willing to share their real views. However, an anonymous qualitative survey where you are sharing in an open-ended, answering open-ended questions, sharing your views in a way freely, in a way in which there's no risk, if that was your concern, for somebody knowing who you are or getting any backlash because of any views you had, then you were able to share your views freely. So because of these reasons, we opted for this approach and this method, and we were able to attract 31 participants, which was very, very positive and for us extortive. Initially, if we were going to do interviews, we were aiming to interview 10 church leaders. So getting this volume of participation was very positive, and we did get some really, really good insights from there as well. So we launched an online open-ended survey, and the survey explored the theological beliefs, the pastoral experiences, and also the church practices of Black and African church leaders in the UK. So this is a profile of the autistic adults that we engaged with. So out of the 10 individuals, 8 were female and 2 were male. And their age ranges range between 18 to 45. The majority of them fell between 20s to 30s, the early 20s to 30s group. But this was generally the age range of the people we interacted with. In terms of the Black or the diversity of Black ethnicities, as Léon said, to be Black or African, it doesn't mean one thing. So there's a variety in there. So we wanted to also display that or share that as well. So we had one person who came from the mixed category, who was a mixed race. And then the majority of participants were Black African. So they had some type of African heritage, whether Ghanaian or Nigerian or other African heritage. One was Caribbean, had a Black Caribbean heritage, and one was Black Scottish. So this individual herself, through interviewing, said they didn't really identify, sometimes even within African communities. So they were British born, and for the majority of their life, they had lived and interacted in white spaces. So they described themselves as Black Scottish. So in terms of the Black ethnicities we engaged with, this was the variety. Then when it comes to the variety of church traditions of these participants, the majority, which is 4 of people we engaged with, were Catholic. Initially, when we started recruiting and speaking to people, we found that a surprise, because somehow we had thought that the majority of Black Christians, if you like, or Black or African Christians, would be or belong to African churches, which is why we had also opened up the caveat of interviewing or speaking to and obtaining the views of Black church leaders as well. But we found that people from different traditions engaged, and the majority were Catholic. 2 were evangelical or Pentecostal. So, and these 2 were people who had tried or visited or been part of many, many, many churches, a variety of churches in the past. And later on in the slides, I'll touch on some of those issues. So they, from the descriptions of the church congregations they had participated in and were currently part of, these were evangelical or Pentecostal churches. I've made a difference or a variation between them and African Pentecostal churches because, yes, there's a difference in there. So African Pentecostal churches in the UK would be churches which would have the majority of attendance or majority of the congregation coming from an African heritage or African background, and also identifying as Pentecostal or through their style of worship and approaches showing Pentecostal elements of the Pentecostal tradition. And then one participant did share or clearly said that they belong to a Caribbean Pentecostal type or style church. One interesting observation for me after interacting with our participants was the fact that 70% of them were late diagnosed. The latest being a person who had been diagnosed when they were over 40. So the majority of them were late diagnosed, and especially among the female group, this was very much highlighted. The majority of the females who participated had been diagnosed very later in life. Now, when it comes to the profile of our church leaders, the church leaders we engaged with, 58% were male and 42% were female. And when it comes to the age group, and I felt this was important to note as well, the majority of the church leaders we engaged with were aged between 35 and 44. So not, because in African church studies, there's what is called the first and the second generation. And the first generation are usually the older adults, either in terms of church leaders or even congregation members, who a lot of the time were the originators of that church group or the founders. And then the second generation would be their children and other younger people who had come after them. But for me, it was interesting to highlight and to note and to see and observe that the majority of the church leaders we had interacted and engaged with were actually from a very young age group, bordering towards what we would consider to be second generation kind of age groups. And this has implications maybe for the kind of views and how or they have on the matter, or how they express some of these ideas. And then when it comes to the ethnic diversity as well, so a large majority, to a large extent, were Black Africans. So 90% of the church leaders identified as Black African. So leaders coming from or having some sort of Black African heritage. 2 had Black Caribbean heritage, and 1 had an other Black background, which was not indicated or spelled out. And then when it comes to the denominational backgrounds or the church traditions these church leaders came from, again, largely Pentecostal. So to a large extent, the majority of them identified their church tradition as Pentecostal. We also had some Baptists, Methodists, charismatic, evangelical. So there was a good variety of church traditions among the church leaders we engaged with. So I'm now going to go on and talk through some of the findings from our research with the Black autistic adults group. A key theme that stood out for us was the desire to belong. So we started by highlighting the absence or the perceived absence, the visible absence of Black autistic Christians in church and faith spaces. But after speaking to and engaging with this group, we came to understand that they had a deep longing to belong. So they wanted to be in church. And for many of them, this had led them to do a lot of church shopping or hopping. So many of them had visited many churches, tried many churches, just in a bid to find somewhere where they could be comfortable, where they would feel accepted, and where they could call a spiritual home. So many of them had the desire to belong, a deep longing for a genuine spiritual home. And for them, belonging also didn't just mean presence, but belonging that went beyond just being present or a part of a congregation, but belonging that translated into participation, full participation in all aspects of church life. So for each theme, I do have some quotes from the research just to emphasize and highlight or bring to the fore the actual voices of the Black autistic individuals. So one of them said, "I miss community. I miss church. I miss people that have genuine love." And this individual was someone who had started off in a church that they felt comfortable in, was very welcoming, but they had to move from that area. They had moved into a new area where they had struggled, or they currently struggle to find a community that was accepting, a community where they would feel comfortable and somewhere they would call home. And so they were always reminiscing and remembering, the past experience about missing church. So currently they are home and they don't go to church because they haven't found a place that they can call home. So missing church and missing people who have a genuine love. Another participant, Irene said, "I started attending church by myself at age 14. I went from church to church. I went to 4 churches before the age of 18. And she explains the context for this comment, that she started as a child going to church with her parents, and then along the line her parents became, in her words, fed up with how she was being treated, how they were also being treated and judged in that community, and then they decided not to go to church anymore. But she still had the desire to go to church, the longing to connect with faith, and so she started going to church by herself from the age 14, and by the time she was 18, she had tried 4 different churches, still looking for a place to belong. Another core theme that came out was the theme of access denied, and we rephrased this as exclusion by design. And this goes to explain how the majority of churches or church life appear or seem to be designed for a certain group of people. And that group of people are neurotypical people. So somebody who enjoys reading, can read from a screen, sing from a screen, who likes noise, who can stand up and sit down, who can dance, who can sing. And if we look at some of the qualities of churches and church life and church practice, autistic, or some of these autistic individuals were feeling that these spaces are not designed for us. So we are excluded by the design. Maybe not intentional, but even if unintentional, excluded by the design of church practice, of church life, and of how churches some or many churches just operate. Some spoke about rejection and infantilization. So there was one participant who said that because of how they behave and how they appear, even beyond the age of 18, in the church they were expected to be with Sunday school. So it got to the point when they were like, no, I don't want to be here. Nobody here is my age mate. And then they had to try and find somewhere else, another group, so somewhere else where they would really fit in and belong. And then when it comes to church participation, so as I said in the previous slide, for many of our participants, belonging goes beyond just presence. So they want to be in church. Many of them know and articulate very well their callings and their desire to be able to minister and use their gifts in the church communities where they belong. And we saw many examples of, participants making comments like Amma, who said, that she had joined the choir and she wanted to lead to sing some songs. And one person actually said boldly that I'm actually someone with a disability and that a person with a disability cannot lead. And so access to leadership and to participation in this ministry was denied to them. Participants also mentioned the issue of tokenistic inclusion. And Ifwa said they know that people want to be involved, but they, and she's talking about autistic people, don't know how to talk. So they, the church, let them do the kitchen thing or something. And she was talking about this from her own experience, about how in the church community, she's been always active and she was always doing things. But a lot of the time, because she had certain communication difficulties, couldn't express herself very well at times, she would be relegated to, tasks in the kitchen, somewhere behind the scenes where nobody would see her. And in a way, her not being able to really do what she wanted to do. So they talk about tokenistic inclusion. Oh, let's find something for them to do. Let them do the kitchen thing or something. And this is just not enough or appropriate. There was also a lot of sharing about sensory overwhelm, whether in terms of the lighting in churches, the sound and the height of the sound of music, microphones not working well, space, how people are seated and not having enough space to move around. So there was a lot of information shared about discomfort from sensory overwhelm, which had led many participants to just stop going to church. So one participant, Irene, said, in my church, it is so bright. That's why I'm not going as often, because I can't see. I will struggle. I'll be covering my eyes throughout the whole service. And I'm sorry, I'm not getting told off by my pastor another week. So she was struggling with the lighting, and the church leaders didn't understand why she would come to church and want to cover her eyes or, have those issues. And because of this, she's decided, that's me being access denied. I just can't be in such a space. Then, because this, the focus of this research, the access denied research in particular, is about intersections. And this particular intersection we are discussing this morning is the intersection of Black ethnicity with faith and autism. We did ask a question to our participants about what it meant, what the experience was to be Black, autistic, and a Christian. And their responses helped us to draw some of these conclusions. And those conclusions come under the theme of intersectional marginalization. So for some participants, they explained that being Black and autistic almost compounded, was like a double whammy, compounded invisibility. So to use Jo's own words, she said, the fact that I am Black alone comes with a little resentment from people. Then having to be autistic at the same time, I'm looked on as a less privileged person. So she's talking about the consequences, some of the consequences, negative consequences that can be associated with race and racism in many spaces, and how that already causes problems. And then to be autistic in addition to that then means, it's a double issue. You are relegated, like she said, looked on as a less privileged person. So being Black and autistic compounded the invisibility of Black autistic individuals. And then another key highlight was the fact that racial stereotypes obscure autistic traits. And for many participants in some of the things they shared, what it looked like was that when they interacted in spaces, people saw their race before their autism, which meant sometimes how they presented, when they presented autistic traits, these were misinterpreted or interpreted through racial stereotypes. So Ifwa said, it's hard to even think about autism here because it feels like color is what is different. So people see race first before the autism, and there can be misinterpretation of autistic traits based on racial stereotypes. Afua again spoke about double inclusion or racial bias and ableism. So she made this comment that, so the main thing I feel about Blackness and autism is the dismissal of needs. So, oh, your child is naughty. Oh, you are this because of your culture. So there is a racial bias and also a dismissal and ableism that occurs when Black autistic adults present in certain spaces. Then finally, the systemic disbelief and lack of diagnosis. So for several participants, and that's why it was interesting for me to share the lateness of the diagnosis of the majority, 70% of our participants who had been diagnosed very, very late in life. And some participants spoke about difficulty in trying to obtain a diagnosis, sometimes based on the racial stereotypes. So they are disbelieved when they go and seek support or help or assessment for autism. And some of their presentations are dismissed as racial stereotypes. So Irene said, I was not taken seriously, and trying to get a diagnosis, trying to get it sped up was another problem. It was only until I moved back home, had a domestic abuse case on me, then from there, that's when I got help. And it took so long to get the help. But once I got the help, it got a bit better. So there can be issues of disbelief, systemic disbelief, and lack of diagnosis, or in the examples of the people we interacted with, instances of very late diagnosis for some Black autistic individuals. Then a lack of awareness. Participants spoke of a lack of awareness, not on their part, but lack of awareness on the part of other people. So a lot of the rejection and non-acceptance and exclusion they experienced came from a lack of knowledge of other people on autism. They mentioned people's misinterpretation of autism, sometimes as naughtiness in faith spaces, sometimes as lack of faith, or demonic. So you are behaving this way, you're not autistic, you just don't lack faith or believe and this will change, or this is not from God. So they did advocate for the need for culturally aware education. Joe said, because of our African culture, when we see someone behaving in a certain way, we may think they are naughty or they don't have home training or that their parents don't care for them. Irene also said, I want people to do more research, not just assume, for them to ask more questions, for them to seek more knowledge first. Because she quotes the Bible, it says in Hosea 4:6, my people perish for lack of knowledge. Finally, theologies of autism also came through. And as I've mentioned in the previous slides, people, this didn't come from the participants themselves, but these were views they had heard from people, theological views they had heard from people, which were mixed. So some seeing autism as demonic, some seeing it as divine, diversity, and a gift. So mixed messages when it came to some of the theologies they encountered in faith spaces. Then there was also a lot of talk about the pray it away narratives and how harmful these were. And in the next slide, just to share some autistic voices on this issue of theologies. So I'll just choose from the second one, Afua. Afua said they'll pray for anxiety, but I think a lot of people put stuff down to anxiety when it's actually sensory needs. Then you pray for your anxiety and you're like, my brain is wired to be sensitive to this kind of smell or something, so I can't. So the fact that people misinterpret sensory issues for certain conditions that are not actually what they are because of misunderstanding and lack of knowledge about autism. So I think, yes, I have spoken for a long time. I'm going to hand over to Léon to talk us through some of the insights that came from our engagement with Black church leaders.
Thank you, Sheila, for presenting that part of the research. Yes, I'm going to present some of the results that or just insights that we got from the survey with church leaders. We know from the literature that sometimes church leaders have particular views of disabilities or how welcoming they are and all of that don't necessarily match with autistic people, neurodivergent people, disabled people. And so for our project, it was important to do that piece of the research as well and to get a more rounded picture, as it were. And so here are some of the insights that we got. Next slide, please, Sheila. Right. So first, knowledge and theology. So it's one of the things that we asked is like, how knowledgeable are you about autism? And it was quite interesting to see that actually most respondents said that they had a good knowledge, maybe not very good, but a good knowledge. As we go through the next couple of slides, you will see that we need to actually, we see a discrepancy between, yes, a good knowledge and the kind of knowledge that they had, which was certainly not necessarily the knowledge that would come from the most recent knowledge in autism communities. And so there's this kind of a mismatch, maybe even. So it was quite interesting to see that. So, but there was a highly varied understanding. So some had a kind of scientific understanding of autism. This is what autism is, according to the DSM-5, the Bible of Psychiatrists, or some saw it really as a spiritual warfare, probably quoting the Bible of theologians or church leaders, and anything in between. Many described autism as a disability, an imperfection, a birth defect, and some link it to the fall, others to demonic causes. Definitely that kind of the sense of autism is the result of brokenness, right? And it's not from God. So there was a small number of people, respondents, who saw autism as something that was coming from God or God-given diversity, and who saw autism as being different, not less. But it must be said that the overwhelming majority of the faith leaders in our survey saw autism as definitely not God-given. Interestingly, it's not that binary, though. It's not like, autism is just bad or autism is absolutely good. Especially within the larger group of people who said, well, autism is not from God. Nevertheless, many said, well, but it can be used for God's glory. So disabilities have maybe a function in that sense, and it can teach us something. And so even though there was like the overwhelming majority view autism as not being from God, nevertheless, they were keen on including autistic people in their faith communities and care for them the best way possible. The most common responses to autism and to the question, what do you pray for? Because that was one of the questions that we included, because prayer reveals a lot about your theology and what you really think autism is. And so the most common response was that they pray, the church leaders pray for healing or even deliverance. Now, I want to make one comment, a little bit of side comments. Sometimes there's this kind of stereotype that autism is in Black communities always seen as demonic or something like that. That is not the overwhelming responses that we got. The overwhelming response was it's not from God, but it was certainly not overwhelmingly like, oh, these are demonic forces or something like that. There were some who said that, but that was not the overwhelming response. Prayer for healing was quite overwhelming in terms of an overwhelming majority said that they pray for healing. Another pastoral practice, not prayer, but like how do you do your ministry? And there was quite some awareness about the need for quiet spaces, maybe in the church hall. There was some sensory awareness. There was awareness that maybe it's useful to work with pictures and symbolic communication. However, many noticed the lack of training. We asked them like, okay, so what do you think you need in terms of resources, or what do you think in general? Like, what do you need? And that the one thing that really stood out there was we have a lack of training, we have a lack of awareness, we have a lack of knowledge, we have a lack of resources. To come back to what I said earlier, so even though most people said we have a good knowledge of autism, it kind of contrasts with what we noticed in terms of there's a lack of training and all of that in our communities. And so there is the fear of stigma. And there's a reluctance to disclose autism in the families. And I saw in the chat, I said, well, it's, you know, the fact that you didn't get so many participants, or you focused on adults, not adolescents, for example. And there was definitely this sense of reluctance to disclose that you're autistic, and even families would be reluctant sometimes to disclose that they had an autistic child in their family or an autistic adult in their family. So that was certainly there, and that has to do, I think, with that that context, that culture, the church culture of autism. If you see that as something that is broken, then as an autistic person, why would you disclose that you're autistic, right? There is not a welcoming culture in that church at that point. Next slide, please, Sheila. We also asked for the blessings because it's really important, I think, in autism studies in general, but also certainly in autism theology, that we do not just see autism as a challenge, something that is difficult to live with or something like that. Actually, there is strengths, there is blessings. And so we wanted to ask the church leader as well, like, okay, so what's the blessing that you've experienced if you have ministered to autistic persons in your congregation? And some of the things that were said, that some faith leaders said, well, I'm just, yeah, the more I engage with this person, the more I'm learning to empathize with them. I learn a lot about being patient sometimes, but also just the sheer joy of you know, having that church member in my congregation. The church leaders appreciated autistic members' honesty, their creativity, their musical gifts. And there was, with some, I should say, the realization that the diversity enriches the body of Christ, including neurodiversity. So that came through as well with some. There were challenges reported. I already talked about a lack of knowledge, lack of training. There was some theological searching, maybe is maybe a better word than confusion, I don't know. But there was this like, is this from God, or is this from the devil? And a few of our participants raised those kind of questions, and we're a bit on the fence. Like, we want to be really affirmative, but we also see, you know, the disability in autism and all of that, and they couldn't really square that with their theology. So they were on a journey, I think. The resource scarcity, so just no space. Our church hall is so small, we don't have space for, you know, a quiet space in the church hall, or that's those kind of things. We just don't have the people to give the more attention that some autistic people might need. We don't have a structured inclusion plan. And again, as I said before, there's that cultural silence. So, of course, it is sometimes difficult to disclose as an autistic person yourself, or as a parent, due to shame and fear of judgment. At the same time, of course, when church leaders don't know that they have an autistic member in their church, how can they then amend their ministries in ways that are appropriate? But then this, not to blame anyone who's autistic or a parent of an autistic child for not disclosing autism, but it points to that culture and all of that. Right. And so there was this theological surging or confusion, whatever you want to call that. And so I'm just reading out 2 quotes. For some, autism manifests as a gift. For others, it's a difficult burden. If God only gives good gifts, then the difficulties associated with autism are not from him, unless we can confidently say that the difficulties associated are also a good gift. But how can it be a good gift when someone is suffering? So you can just see how this person was searching. And I think this was actually one of the 3 people who said that they had a very good knowledge of autism. Interestingly, of those 3, 2 had a very affirmative view of autism, and this 3rd person was really on the fence and really searching theologically. Another person said, well, why does anything exist? Autism exists for a purpose, and we have eyes to see, and if we have eyes to see, then we might be blessed in understanding the purpose. So if we try to integrate these 2 data sets, if you want, the interviews with Black adults and the survey with Black church leaders, there's some things that we can highlight. So first of all, Black autistic adults said, we want to belong. That was an overarching theme in our data. And church leaders, on the other hand, said, we don't know how to support. And then the autistic adults said, we are misunderstood. And that kind of aligns with the Black church leaders saying, well, yeah, we lack training. We lack a good theology here. The autistic people said, we're told to pray it away. And indeed, Black church leaders, the overwhelming majority said, we pray for healing. And both said, we need awareness. I think the autistic adults meant there, especially church leaders and churches and the congregations need awareness. But the church leaders admit that they need more awareness. And so the convergence there is that shared need for understanding, for education or re-education, maybe learning about what autism actually is, and a theological renewal. That is what both data sets actually tell us, or at least, well, the autistic, let me say that differently. Theological renewal is definitely something that came up with the autistic adults. With the church leaders, that really depends on whether you agree with their theologies or not. And that's not up to me to say that. I'm not going to make any value judgments on that, but it is something that comes clearly out as something to look into. And then the tension that there is clearly between the data sets is the healing versus the acceptance, the inclusion versus deliverance, the theology of fixing versus a theology of being. So to kind of summarize this in one slide, what we found here, if you have a scale from exclusion to acceptance, it's remarkable that looking at the right side, at the acceptance side, 8 out of the 10 autistic people accepted themselves completely with their autism. There was 1 who didn't accept it at all, and there was 1 who was, I would say, on a journey towards acceptance. If you look at the church leaders, the others here, some church leaders were very accepting of autism, but most were on the other end of the scale at the exclusion side. Not deliberately exclusion, as Sheila already said, but it's exclusion by design. And I hope that our overviews of the data have made that clear. So there is this non-acceptance of autistic people that came out very clearly. And it's either theologically, that's exclusion by theological design. So again, if you see autism as something that is a result of the fall or demonic or a result of brokenness, then that's theological exclusion. No matter how inclusive you want to do and be, if you basically fundamentally see someone as broken because of their autism, that's not going to be a welcoming atmosphere for that person. Or there's non-acceptance by unawareness, and then it's exclusion by cultural design, by a neurotypical society that we live in here in the UK. And I think that is true for African or Black communities as well. So there is a need for theological engagements. We need to re-educate, maybe need for redefining healing and wholeness. What is that actually? So here's some theological work to do maybe. And when it comes to the unawareness, there's a need for raising awareness very clearly. And that came out from both data sets. And hopefully that will lead, at least in our view, Sheila and I think that should lead, hopefully, to more acceptance of autistic people in Black faith communities. I'm going to hand over to Sheila again.
Thank you, Léon, for speaking us through that aspect of the research. So just in a way of concluding and drawing some concluding points or summary points, what does it take or what do we need towards an inclusive future? As Léon has already explained in the preceding slide, the need for theological re-education or education on neurodiversity, and not just that, but the use or the engagement with African and Black theologies as resources for some of that theological education. Also, awareness is needed, but that awareness and training must be culturally contextual. So it must be sensitive, there must be sensitivity to how these are presented in African context. And in quotes, I've spoken about decolonizing autism. We've not had a lot of time to discuss some of those issues, but how autism is presented to Africans or to the Black community, for example, Léon was saying, if something is presented to an African Pentecostal Christian as sickness and disease, then there's no way they're going to accept it or claim that it is from God. So sometimes how some of these issues have been presented, the Western context from which they have grown, developed, and been presented into some of the African contexts, then lead to the resulting views or pushbacks, if you like, that come with them. Then also when it comes to the issue of practical access, a lot of the research that were some I have done personally in the UK shows a dire need. One of the key challenges for Black and African churches in the UK is getting a space to worship. So I recently did a report which I titled People with Churches and Churches Without People, Without Buildings. Yeah. So that discrepancy, if you like, with a lot of traditional established churches now selling off properties because they are empty, they have no people to worship in them. And on the other hand, a lot of burgeoning and growing African and Black diaspora church communities growing, but having no places to worship. So when it comes to the issue of practical access and having the space to provide sensory-friendly services, that is one challenge that will have to be addressed in order to make this possible. Also, there has to be representation, so centering autistic voices in church communities, in faith communities, and moving beyond charitable inclusion to participatory belonging. But most importantly, there has to be dialogue. And with this research, that is what we are trying to start, a dialogue that occurs between all different parties involved. So not just scholars, but scholars interacting with pastors and advocates of autistic individuals and autistic individuals themselves. So there has to be a platform and spaces for different groups of people to come together to talk and to gain knowledge from each other and exchange ideas on this topic. And those partnerships and platforms have to be facilitated. So in conclusion, Black autistic Christians are not absent. They are just unseen. I saw in the comments somebody talking about maybe high masking, and that is a possibility. So they are in our churches, they are in churches, but they are just not unseen and they are not known. Belonging begins with awareness, theological reimagination, and empathy. And inclusion should be seen as discipleship, not charity. So we need to move from access denied to access granted. And that's to end with a quote from one of the participants. It is about the full participation of every member of Christ's body in all their God-given nature. So giving access is not about a tick box exercise. It should be about the full participation of every member of Christ's body in all their God-given nature. So that brings us to the end of this presentation and this part of our sharing. But I'm going to hand over to one of my colleagues to talk about a platform that has been created where this conversation can be continued or can take place. So I'll hand over to Dorcas to explain these next few slides.
Dorcas, are you on?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. I'm Dorcas, and I just wanted to come in quickly here to introduce the NEFC Network, which stands for the Neurodiversity, Faith and Cultural Identity, which is a subgroup that we have under the Center of Autism and Theology. NEFC is really a platform that brings together researchers and practitioners who are interested about exploring the intersections between neurodiversity, religion, and spirituality, and cultural identities. And I should preface here that we use the term cultural identities to encompass both the linguistic minorities as well as ethnic minoritized groups. So our network came from recognition that conversations about neurodiversity often overlook the ways that faith, culture, and language shape neurodiversity experiences. So at NEFC, we try to engage in thoughtful discussions that illustrate how neurodiversity is understood and lived across different communities and different traditions. At the core of NEFC is a vision that is grounded in community and belonging, inclusion, faith-informed inquiry, culture and linguistic perspectives, critical reflection, intersectionality, collaboration, and co-production. We seek to center voices and experiences that are often marginalized, creating a space where diverse expression of identity can be explored, affirmed, and meaningfully connected. So our goal is not only to talk about inclusion, but also to practice it by cultivating a research community that values under-researched and underrepresented identities. And in doing so, we hope to affect real and lasting change. Ultimately, we aspire to serve as a bridge between academia and faith communities to create a two-way connection that allow theory and practice to inform each other. And this is done through critical dialogue, collaboration, and meaningful engagement. So for anyone who may be interested, So we aim also to enrich discussions on neurodiversity culture, contributing a new perspective beyond the neurotypical Western discourse. So if you are interested, please send us an email at the cat@abdn.ac.uk, and we hope to welcome you soon into our subgroup. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dorcas. I'll now hand over to Audrey.
Thank you, Dorcas. Thank you, Sheila and Léon. I'm sorry, everyone. It ran a bit long, but I think we needed to hear all of that as well. Let's take that 5-minute break and be back. We will have a shorter time for Q&A, I think, and I do see quite a few questions in the chat group. So let's take 5 minutes. We'll come back at 12:10, and we will end on time. Thank you. Go do what you need to do. It's 12:10. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Welcome back. A reminder to the speakers answering questions, please keep to the time. We have 20 minutes. And I think we can just go to pretty much the first question that was asked. I don't know if it was kind of answered already. It was, are there not Black autistic adults, or are they just masking in the church setting? And I think we will fold that into the second question, which was, did you encounter people who had been misdiagnosed, for example, with mental health conditions? Let's start with that question.
Yes. Yeah, like we were saying, the first one we have, broached that topic a bit. The fact that Black autistic adults are present, they are just unseen. Masking could be, yes, present. Very recently, I was having a discussion with somebody on this, and they were telling me, oh, I think I need to seek an assessment. And then that just showed me there would be a lot of people themselves who are unaware, a lot of Black autistic adults themselves who are unaware that they are autistic, and they are just becoming aware of some of these things. So yes, they do exist. They are just not seen in those spaces. And then in terms of misdiagnosis, we didn't encounter anyone who had been misdiagnosed. What the issue for most participants was accessing some of those official diagnostic channels in the first place. So we saw the participant who was saying it's been difficult just to try and get an assessment. So getting the assessment, getting into those channels is the problem. It's not about going in there and then being diagnosed and having to go back. What maybe similar, not a misdiagnosis, but what the majority of people experienced was actually a dismissal of their nature. So especially in the context of culture, and a participant who was saying, she was being told, no, it's nothing. You grow out of it. It's nothing. You're fine. Pray it away, and all of those things. So there were instances of a dismissal of needs and not being believed that you are autistic in the cultural context. So not necessarily a diagnosis. So those were the issues there.
It's pretty much the same question about what were the requirements to be included in the study, and did you find there was difficulty in obtaining official autism assessments that disproportionately impacts Black autistics? So perhaps, I don't know, were there people that came who couldn't get an official diagnosis but were interested in participating?
Yeah, we actually made our doors as open, as wide as possible. So the requirements were, first of all, where you had to be Black, identify as Black or African, you had to be Christian, you had to be 18 plus. And then when it came to the autistic diagnosis, you had to be either self-diagnosed or officially diagnosed. So we didn't put a barrier in that sense. So we did open the door that's why, to ensure as many people who identified as autistic could come forward. Although I think out of the 10 participants, there was only one who didn't have an official diagnosis, but the majority then had the official diagnosis. But for the majority of them, and very later on in life as well. Yeah. So we didn't bar anybody from participating if they didn't have official diagnosis, but self-diagnosis was also accepted.
But you did say that most of them did get a diagnosis, and that quite a lot of them were late diagnosis of the female participants. So
yes.
So they had, how do I put this? Did they say that they had gone to seek it out for themselves, and it was not, the kind of thing that your family members had kind of tried to get for them? It was self-directed, seeking out of a diagnosis.
Yes, to a large extent. Many had grown up as children, knowing they were different, feeling they were different, and even relatives attesting that they were different, but they hadn't been recognized as autistic. And for many of them, it had taken them to grow and become more self-aware, and in that self-awareness, gone to explore assessments and then come to understand why they had been feeling this way all their lives. For one participant, she was saying, "Oh, now it all made sense to me." Yes, and so now she can accept herself, that she's fine and she's okay, and can even explore what support there is. So many would have missed out on any support from childhood because they hadn't been recognized or put forward for autistic assessments.
Thank you, Sheila. There's a question on what are the next steps for research?
I'll leave that for Léon.
All right. What are the next steps for the research? I don't know exactly, as in I don't necessarily have anything lined up myself, other than, well, actually we started the next step by, for example, creating this NUFC group, this Neurodiversity, Faith and Cultural Identities group. We started that early this calendar year, I think. And that was one of the steps that we wanted to take, because we heard from more and more people that they were interested in this conversation, and so we thought, well, why not just create a platform? And that's not necessarily a research platform, as Dorcas has explained. It's bringing together researchers, practitioners, people with lived experience of different identities, if you want, or identity markers, and part of the purpose of the group is also to find out, where should we go next in terms of the research. But I think our project has made clear that we need to look deeper into theologies of autism within Black African communities, and dialogue with Black scholars, African scholars in this. I think personally, what I would hope is that there's going to be more research on autism in Black communities, but also other culturally minoritized communities, but also not just on autism, but also other neurodivergences. So what about ADHD? What about dyslexia? All of that. How does that impact how you worship? How is that viewed by the community? Those kind of things. So if anyone is listening and wants to do a PhD on that or something like that, do get in touch. I don't have funding, but I do have the desire that this research is being done. So yeah, that's the kind of, I can see future projects, I can see future research, and hopefully that will happen.
Thank you, Léon. I think this is an important question. Do the findings of this minority, well, I think it's Black church pastor group, does it mirror any previous research amongst the wording is Western pastors, but I think it would just be like non-Black, maybe white majority churches? Is this a widespread problem amongst Christian leaders in general, that autism is seen as something to pray away, or does it seem specifically related to this group? So that is the question.
Yeah, I remember making a note to myself, and I was looking for it when I was analyzing that, because the focus of this particular research was Black church leaders, and these are the views we are presenting. That doesn't necessarily mean that these views are exclusive to Black or African church leaders. But like the person asking the question is saying or noting, these are widespread issues. So when it comes to theology, and maybe Léon can also comment on that, but theology, the developing theology around autism and disability is not exclusive to any one particular group of church leadership. But the reason why it's presenting well in the way we have done is because this was our focus group. Apart from that, I did mention that out of the, like talking about the traditions in which the participants came from, only 4 came from Black Pentecostal, was it 3 Black Pentecostal churches? So 4 came from a Catholic tradition, and we did ask them about the nature and makeup of their churches, who their church leaders were even the ethnic backgrounds of their church leaders. And for them, there were many church leaders who were white or mixed. So when it comes to that presentation and the presentation of church traditions that these our participants came from, they weren't largely from Black Pentecostal or black churches, but there was a variety, which means some of the views and the experiences they had had, well, yes, as Black autistic adults, but not necessarily at the hands of Black or African church leaders. So yeah, that caveat needs to be highlighted.
Yeah, if you want, I can add a little bit to that. I think what we see in our research in across our different research projects is, and across different cultures where we try to do our research, is that churches are heavily influenced by their cultures, right? And even though theologically you might say, well, we need to be countercultural in certain aspects and culture affirming in other aspects, by and large, the way the social dynamics work, the way we understand things like autism, are heavily influenced by our surrounding culture. And therefore, what you will see is that congregations at large, but certainly also the leaders, very often just work with cultural perspectives that they just see in their surrounding cultures. So a lot of white pastors or ministers will have the cultural, like, white dominant Western perspective on autism. Now that perspective is changing, not least due to autism self-efficacy, and so you see more and more awareness in churches that autism is not necessarily deficit, and also you can more fruitfully see it as a difference. For example, if you're in other cultures that are if you're I can imagine, but Sheila knows this better than I, so I want to be careful with what I'm saying here. But I can imagine if you're a Black pastor of a Black majority church, then you are immersed in that Black culture, and maybe that's even more specifically a Nigerian culture or a Ghanaian culture or whatever, and that will also shape and influence how you look at autism, and therefore also how you theologically look at it. So I think Sheila made that comment, if not here, then somewhere in our notes in preparation of this in our analysis, is that culture and religion in African context is synonymous almost, right? And so, yes, of course, that's going to shape how you look at autism as well. And we see this across different cultures. So hopefully that helps to answer that question.
Thanks, Léon. Very quickly, so we have 5 minutes left. I'm interested in this question because I'm in a group of autistic women who are Asian, and many of them had this experience. So the question is, did the women seeking diagnosis have a child with a diagnosis? Could that have influenced them seeking a diagnosis?
Yeah, so there was one instance. So the most, I don't know if I can say the most late, but the oldest participant got diagnosed, and it was very fresh, like in the 6 months before speaking to us. And they had an autistic child. And it was through, yes, going through the process of, the assessments and just taking care of their own child that they came to also understand that they were autistic and get an assessment. Yeah, so there was one example for that. But for the majority of participants, like I said, when it comes to the age range, they were fairly young, so between 18 and the early 20s, who didn't have any children. Yeah, but one participant did have, yes, an autistic child. And even in the interview, she did talk a lot, not just about her experience, but also about the experience of her child as well.
Really interesting. There are two kind of related questions. Again, we've got to be very careful about time, but the two people that asked about those who tried to participate but were like seen as bogus participants, and why do you think, firstly, how do you think it happened? How do you figure it out? But also, what did you learn about people wanting to participate who were not?
Yeah, so that is so mind-boggling. So we started initially our recruitment, and we were so excited when the emails were pouring in with people showing it. I'm like, Léon, 20, and we were so excited. But then when we went closer to screen, especially because we were doing online interviews, which meant there was, and we had advertised on social media, so there was a very wide reach. So one of the ways we had decided to go about this was, this was an online interview, and we required everyone to at least be on camera for some part of the interview. And it was through that, so when people refused to turn on their cameras, and sometimes when they did turn on their cameras, the environment. So being an African myself, so I encountered one individual. I actually saved some videos for Léon to watch, which I called, bogus interviews. Came on camera with chickens crowing and just looking at the environment. I was like, you are nowhere in Britain, And then sometimes we use screening stories and questions to just probe a little further. So where in the UK are you based? What's the name of your church? And we'll be searching frantically and on Google just to verify some of these facts. Yeah, so why people, there was that attraction? Well, it's mind-boggling. One possible explanation would be the fact that we did offer a little gift to encourage participation. So maybe that was a key attraction. But even beyond that, when we try to re-advertise and just obscure that fact until we had proven that people were genuine, still we did get people trying to get through the door who didn't really qualify. So I don't know if it's one of the issues with modern day research and what researchers can do to overcome bogus participants.
I suppose it's just like people. I think it's modern day life where they're just trolls, and seeing opportunities to prank people. Okay. I think we've got 1 minute left, or maybe 3. So. Somebody asked, could this research be part of reading or part of ministerial training? I think that's a great question. How could we include this sort of research?
Yeah, so we have highlighted the dire need for awareness and for training, both from the perspective of Black autistic individuals and some of the church leaders we engaged with. So I think, yes, that should be a necessary part of training and in calling people into ministry. Apart from that, there should also be opportunities for people who are already in ministry to engage and to learn about some of these things in order to better minister and disciple all the people of God. Yeah, so that is what we would hope would be one of the outcomes of our research.
I mean, I know there is some work on neurodiversity in theological educational institutes, and they are trying to include some of this, but it's an ongoing process. I think it's still very new. So, yeah. And then I think the intersectionality part, being Black and autistic, that's really important to take into account. Okay. I think there are lots of interesting comments. I wouldn't really want to go into them now, but there's some comments of people saying, Sheila, have you read this, or what do you think about that? So if you can go and look into the chat, it might be helpful for you. Thank you everyone for participating. It was, I think there were lots of thoughts that were generated. Please don't apologize also for terminology. We're very broad-minded here, and everyone is on a learning journey. So thank you very much, everyone. The next session starts at 1:30, so you have a full hour to go and have a break, get some food, do whatever you need to do, and please come back for the next session at 1:30. Thank you, everyone.